Fingertips that changed the game. For years, a simple flick of the fingers let fighters dodge some of MMA's most dangerous strikes. Under the old unified rules, a fighter was considered a grounded opponent and therefore protected from knees or kicks to the head if any part of the body touched the mat. Clever athletes realized that any part included a single fingertip. Veterans like John Jones turned this into a defensive weapon, crouching in striking range while casually brushing the canvas with one hand. With just a few fingertips grazing the floor, they gained all the protection of a grounded fighter while staying upright enough to strike or shoot for takedowns. Referees hated it. Fans booed as fighters played a game of cat and mouse, repeatedly touching the mat to bait fouls or stall action. After years of controversy and inconsistent enforcement, the Association of Boxing Commissions finally stepped in. The ABC first rewrote the definition in 2021 to require a full palm or both fists flat on the canvas, adopted by most major commissions through 2022. But the rule evolution continued. In November 2024, the ABC approved another revision, further clarifying grounded fighter positioning, though individual state adoption varies. A minor wording change that keeps evolving has gradually erased one of MMA's most frustrating loopholes: the Vaseline scandal that rewrote procedure. UFC 94 delivered one of the sport's strangest controversies and one of its most important safety rules. During George St. Pierre's welterweight title defense against BJ Penn, cameras caught GSP's cornerman applying Vaseline to the champion's face between rounds, standard practice to prevent cuts. But then the cornerman rubbed those same greasy hands across St. Pierre's shoulders and back. Vaseline, or petroleum jelly, dramatically reduces friction, making a fighter's skin slick and much harder to grip. For a grappler like Penn, whose strategy depended on controlling GSP in the clinch and on the mat, the slippery surface was a nightmare. Penn's team protested mid-fight, forcing the Nevada State Athletic Commission to step in and towel off GSP before the next round. Even though the amount of jelly was small and intent was debated, the optics were disastrous. The commission quickly tightened procedures, ruling that only licensed neutral cut men could apply Vaseline, and that corners were forbidden from touching fighters after the cut man worked. Other athletic commissions followed Nevada's lead, standardizing the rule across the sport. What began as a few dabs of petroleum jelly became the catalyst for one of MMA's most important procedural safeguards: real-time replay revolution. For decades, referees had to make split-second decisions on fouls and accidental clashes with no second chances, even when replays clearly showed they got it wrong. Fighters lost fights due to accidental headbutts ruled intentional, or had victories stolen by phantom eye pokes that cameras proved never happened. The most referees could do was watch the mistake play out, knowing they'd face criticism later, but powerless to fix obvious errors in real time. The breaking point came after a string of high-profile disasters, where slow-motion replays on the broadcast made referees look incompetent. Fans watching at home could see exactly what happened within seconds, but the officials making career-altering decisions were flying blind. Athletic commissions realized they were creating an impossible situation, expecting perfect accuracy from humans while denying them the tools to succeed. Nevada led the charge in 2021, becoming the first commission to allow continuous instant replay during active fights. Now referees can review questionable fouls, accidental clashes, and borderline stoppages without stopping the action for minutes. Other major commissions quickly adopted similar systems through 2022, finally giving officials the same technology fans had been using to second-guess them for years. Tank Abbott's ejection attempt. Mark "Tank" Abbott nearly launched an opponent clear over the octagon fence, creating one of early MMA's most shocking near disasters. At UFC 11 in 1996, the 265-pound brawler lifted Cal Worsham completely off the ground during their heavyweight clash and began carrying him toward the cage wall. Abbott, known more for bar fights than technical grappling, seemed intent on throwing his opponent out of the fighting area entirely. Worsham frantically grabbed at Abbott's shorts and the fence itself as Tank approached the octagon wall, clearly trying to hurl him over the top. The crowd gasped as Abbott lifted the smaller fighter chest high, positioning him like a human projectile aimed at the first row of spectators. Only Worsham's desperate grip on the cage prevented what could have been a catastrophic ejection into the audience. The near miss terrified UFC officials, who immediately recognized the liability nightmare of fighters being thrown into paying customers. Within months, the promotion added a specific rule to its competition guidelines. Any attempt to throw an opponent over or through the cage results in immediate disqualification. Tank's wild moment of aggression accidentally created one of MMA's most important safety regulations: the shorts-grabbing stalemate. Pat Miletich and Mikey Burnett turned a UFC title eliminator into a ridiculous game of grab-ass that forced an emergency rule change. At UFC 16 in 1998, both fighters discovered they could neutralize each other's offense by simply gripping their opponent's shorts. What started as desperate grappling devolved into minutes of two elite welterweights clutching fabric like school children, unable to throw strikes or attempt submissions while locked in a shorts-holding death grip. The crowd booed mercilessly as Miletich and Burnett circled the octagon, each fighter's hands buried in the other's waistband. Neither could generate power for strikes because releasing the shorts meant giving up defensive control. Neither could shoot for takedowns because the constant tugging disrupted their balance and timing. The fight became an absurd standoff that made both athletes look amateurish on pay-per-view. UFC brass watched in horror as their main card featured two championship contenders playing tug-of-war with each other's clothing. The Athletic Commission immediately banned grabbing shorts, gloves, or any part of an opponent's attire in future bouts. What began as tactical desperation became the catalyst for eliminating one of early MMA's most ridiculous strategies. Damage over control revolution. Judges were rewarding the wrong fighters for decades, giving rounds to wrestlers who held opponents down without hurting them, while punishing strikers who dealt real damage. Under the old scoring interpretation, a fighter could get knocked down, bloodied, and battered for 4 minutes, then secure a takedown and control position for the final minute to steal the round. Fans watched obvious winners lose decisions because judges valued positional control more than actual fighting damage. The scoring crisis reached its peak during controversial decisions that defied common sense. Fighters who clearly lost fights walked away with victories simply because they spent more time in top position, even when they inflicted minimal damage. Meanwhile, fighters who hurt their opponents with strikes and submission attempts lost rounds for being controlled on the ground, creating backwards incentives that rewarded stalling over finishing. The Association of Boxing Commissions approved the scoring overhaul in mid-2022, with individual commissions rolling out the changes through 2023. Judges now must score based on damage and impact over positional control, forcing wrestlers to become more aggressive on the ground while giving strikers credit for the damage they inflicted. The gradual implementation finally aligned scoring with what actually determines fight outcomes. UFC's drug testing divorce. The UFC shocked the MMA world by divorcing USADA after 7 years of marriage, creating their own anti-doping program with dramatically different rules. In 2023, the promotion announced they were ending their partnership with the United States Anti-Doping Agency, the same organization that cleaned up Olympic sports, and launching Drug-Free Sport International, with more flexible testing protocols. The move raised immediate questions about whether the UFC was softening its stance on performance-enhancing drugs. USADA had been the sport's strictest watchdog since 2015, catching major stars like Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, and dozens of other fighters with random year-round testing. Their zero-tolerance approach created lengthy suspensions and stripped titles, but also gave MMA credibility as a legitimate sport with real consequences for cheating. When the UFC walked away from this gold standard, critics wondered if business interests were trumping athlete safety. The new drug-free sport program introduced therapeutic use exemptions and reduced random testing frequency compared to USADA's aggressive approach. While UFC officials claimed the change would streamline operations and reduce bureaucracy, many fighters and fans saw it as a step backward from the sport's cleanest era. The divorce marked the end of MMA's most comprehensive anti-doping period and the beginning of a more permissive testing environment. The banned elbow nobody sees. MMA outlawed the most devastating elbow strike in combat sports before most fighters even knew it existed. The 12-6 elbow, a straight-down strike that follows the path of a clock's hands from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, was banned during the original Unified Rules meetings in 2000. The technique was prohibited not because of cage fights, but because of a single demonstration that horrified athletic commissioners who had never seen its destructive power. The ban originated from footage of martial arts demonstrations where practitioners broke stacks of concrete blocks and ice with downward elbow strikes. Commissioners watched these displays and concluded that 12-6 elbows generated too much force to be safely used on human opponents. The problem was that breaking objects requires completely different physics than striking a moving, defending person, but the visual impact of shattered blocks was enough to convince regulators. Jon Jones famously lost his only official defeat to this rule, getting disqualified against Matt Hamill for illegal 12-6 elbows in 2009. The irony is that Jones was dominating Hamill with legal elbows from other angles that were arguably more damaging than the banned technique. 25 years later, the 12-6 elbow remains prohibited across most commissions, making it MMA's most feared strike that fighters almost never get to use. The deadly weight cut solution. Yang Jianbing's death from extreme weight cutting forced one championship to pioneer the most radical hydration rules in combat sports. The Chinese fighter collapsed and died in 2015 after a brutal weight cut for a one event, suffering from the severe dehydration that kills fighters worldwide. CEO Chatri Sityodtong watched his organization become another tragic headline in MMA's ongoing weight-cutting crisis and decided to implement revolutionary testing protocols that other promotions had deemed impossible. Traditional weight cutting allows fighters to dehydrate themselves by up to 30 pounds in the final week before competition, creating dangerous health risks as organs shut down and brain function deteriorates. Fighters routinely cut 20 to 25% of their body weight through saunas, diuretics, and extreme fasting, then rehydrate after making weight. The practice had killed fighters in MMA and wrestling for decades, but athletic commissions struggled to find practical solutions. One championship introduced mandatory hydration testing alongside traditional weigh-ins, using urine samples to detect dangerous dehydration levels. Fighters who fail hydration tests cannot compete regardless of making weight, forcing athletes to maintain healthier cutting practices year-round. The system virtually eliminated extreme weight cuts in one events and became the gold standard that other promotions slowly began adopting as fighter deaths. Shamrock's 36-minute stalemate. Ken Shamrock and Royce Gracie created the most boring fight in UFC history, forcing officials to invent a referee stand-up to prevent future snooze fests. At UFC 5 in 1995, the two legends spent 36 excruciating minutes locked in a guard position with virtually no action, testing the patience of pay-per-view audiences who expected explosive violence. Shamrock controlled Gracie on the ground, but couldn't advance position or land meaningful strikes, while Gracie held guard without attempting submissions. The super fight dragged on without time limits or judges, creating a tactical stalemate where neither fighter wanted to risk position for offense. Shamrock feared Gracie's submission skills, while Gracie couldn't escape Shamrock's superior size and strength. The crowd grew restless as minutes turned to half hours, with nothing happening except two elite fighters neutralizing each other through conservative positioning. UFC officials realized they had created a monster. Unlimited time fights could theoretically last hours if both fighters played it safe. The Shamrock-Gracie marathon directly led to referee stand-ups for inactivity and eventual time limits for all contests. What began as a super fight between legends accidentally became the blueprint for preventing tactical stalling that could kill MMA as entertainment. Big John's ultimatum. Big John McCarthy threatened to quit the UFC unless referees could stop fights without fighters tapping out, creating the modern TKO that saves countless careers. In the early 1990s, referees could only end contests when fighters submitted, were knocked unconscious, or their corners threw in the towel. This meant conscious fighters getting beaten senseless had to continue absorbing punishment until they either went limp or verbally quit, a barbaric standard that horrified the sport's most experienced official. McCarthy watched helpless as fighters took unnecessary brain damage and lopsided beatdowns, unable to intervene even when the outcome was obvious. The breaking point came during brutal ground-and-pound sessions where defenders were clearly defeated but remained conscious and refused to tap. Big John realized he was presiding over potential permanent injuries or deaths while his hands were tied by archaic rules designed for one-on-one duels, not mixed martial arts competition. The legendary referee delivered an ultimatum to UFC management. Give referees discretionary stopping power or find a new head official. The promotion quickly adopted technical knockout rules that allowed refs to end fights when fighters could no longer intelligently defend themselves. McCarthy's threat fundamentally changed MMA safety standards and established the referee as the ultimate protector of fighter welfare, not just an enforcer of rules. The groin shot free-for-all. MMA's early years featured a shocking parade of intentional low blows that made fights unwatchable until commissions finally banned groin strikes. Throughout 1995 and 1996, fighters routinely targeted opponents' groins as a legitimate strategy, delivering devastating kicks and knees to the most vulnerable part of the male anatomy. The technique was considered fair game under no-rules fighting, creating gruesome spectacles where tough guys writhed in agony from targeted testicle strikes. Keith Hackney's infamous groin strikes against Joe Son became the poster child for this disturbing trend, with Hackney repeatedly punching Son's exposed groin during a ground exchange. The crowd's mixture of cheers and horrified gasps perfectly captured the sport's identity crisis. Was this athletic competition or sadistic entertainment? Similar incidents across multiple promotions showed that allowing groin attacks turned skilled martial artists into schoolyard bullies. By 1997, mounting pressure from athletic commissions and broadcast partners forced the UFC and other organizations to prohibit direct groin strikes. The ban marked a crucial step in MMA's evolution from spectacle to sport, establishing that certain areas of human anatomy were off-limits regardless of no-holds-barred marketing. What began as anything-goes fighting finally acknowledged basic standards of human decency. The endless draw problem. UFC's early tournaments kept ending in frustrating draws because fights had no time limits and no way to pick winners, forcing the creation of modern judging systems. At UFC 7 and UFC 8 in 1995, multiple tournament bouts went to draws when fighters survived the entire contest without finishing each other, leaving brackets incomplete and fans without clear winners. The promotion had created an impossible situation. Unlimited time fights that somehow needed decisive outcomes for tournament advancement. The draw epidemic reached crisis levels when marquee fights featuring top contenders ended inconclusively, wasting entire pay-per-view cards on non-results. Fans who paid premium prices to watch elite athletes compete walked away without knowing who actually won, while fighters earned identical purses despite vastly different performances. Tournament organizers scrambled to figure out advancement rules when their semi-final bouts produced no winners. Athletic commissions stepped in with a revolutionary solution: mandatory time limits paired with 3-judge scoring systems borrowed from boxing. Fights would now be limited to predetermined durations, and if no finish occurred, 3 trained officials would determine the winner based on round-by-round performance. The system transformed MMA from endurance contests into tactical battles where every minute mattered, finally giving fans the decisive outcomes they demanded. California's rehydration revolution. California shocked the MMA world by capping how much weight fighters could gain back after weigh-ins, pioneering rules that other states are now studying closely. In early 2024, the California State Athletic Commission implemented 10% rehydration limits alongside secondary weigh-ins on fight day, meaning a fighter who weighed 155 pounds could only be 170.5 pounds when entering the cage. The radical departure from traditional weight cutting sent shockwaves through a sport built on extreme dehydration practices. The new system targeted fighters who cut massive amounts of weight, then ballooned back up overnight, creating dangerous size advantages and health risks. A welterweight could traditionally cut from 190 pounds to 170, then rehydrate back to 185 to 190 for the actual fight, essentially competing as a middleweight against true welterweights. This practice led to mismatched contests and continued the cycle of dangerous weight cutting throughout the sport. New Jersey and several other major commissions are now beginning pilot programs or considering similar limits, creating potential momentum for nationwide reform. The secondary weigh-ins and rehydration caps eliminated the biggest cutting advantages in California, while reducing health risks, marking the most significant weight cutting reform since one championship's hydration testing began the movement.